we continue to wade in womanist wisdom with our first panel of the morning, the indispensable tri-formation between gown and town, recognizing the way in which womanists are not bifurcated individuals. We are whole people, recognizing and acknowledging the communities that give birth to us, the places where we are privileged to stay in, and the way in which we share knowledge. Joining us this morning, and they will present in this order, Reverend Cecelia Armstrong, educator and clergy woman. Reverend Dr. Emilie M. Town, Dean of the School of Divinity at Vanderbilt University, and an ordained clergy woman. You may come to the podium as I call your name. The Reverend Dr. Gaynell, Byron, Professor Biblical Scholar and on faculty at Howard University School of Divinity. Probably the only biblical scholar who is extremely knowledgeable in the area of Ethiopian artifacts and a very distinct language in that tradition. The Reverend Dr. Eboni Marshall Turman, who is an assistant professor at Yale University, an ordained clergywoman, and recently acknowledged for the contributions that she pours into students, not only at Yale, but at the various institutions where she has been privileged to serve. And the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, an Episcopalian priest, and the first Black woman to be appointed as a dean within the Episcopal school tradition. They will each share for approximately 15 minutes. We will follow that with a Q&A, and I am going to ask you that if you have extensive comments, to please say those comments, to share them with the presenters during the lunch hour, that we will only take questions for them to answer. Thank you. They will follow again in this order: Reverend Armstrong, Dr. Towns, Dr. Byron, Dr. Turman, Dr. Marshall Turman, and Dr. Brown Douglas.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
I just got to take this in because I'm so pretty. I truly believe that I'm speaking to the choir with this first acknowledgement. However, being a female pastor is still an issue in several places. Many have encountered and endured the tragic situations, but I've learned to find the comedy in it all for survival purposes. I was in South Florida during my first call, and the brother saw me walking across the street. Had no clue that I was a pastor. He started with the standard compliments of my beauty. I was okay with that. I mean, he was attracted to me. But being observant, I noticed his wedding band and knew that he was off limits and that his efforts were ill-intended. However, he continued. So to nip it all in the bud, I said, look, I'm a pastor, and I'm not interested in what you are offering. And all of a sudden, he became a Bible scholar. And in his own mind, he began to rant out loud that God never called a woman. He continued with his rant and enthusiasm and his passion, and I finally interrupted him and said, do you remember that moment at the grave site when Mary went looking for Jesus' body? He nodded in agreement, but was eager to state his immediate defense. He said, yes, I remember. And it was then that Jesus told her to go and tell the brethren. I said, yeah, right. He told her to go and deliver a message. Right? And he agreed and seemed to smile, thinking he had defeated me in this area. And I continued. That's what I do every Sunday morning. I deliver the message. So in my best Loretta Devine, waiting to exhale, walked away from the break behind, I continued on my journey. Only I never looked back to see if he was watching, because I knew he was. Being a female pastor, this was one that was shared amongst some other female clergy. So ladies, thanks for being the first to witness and report the resurrection. And we'll take it from here. The call of my life is to deliver the message. At least that was the beginning of what I thought I was called to do in Charleston, South Carolina, my second call. June 2015 would be my start date, and I was excited for what this meant for me. I would be their second female pastor following Reverend Carolyn Kurtz Hayward. I wouldn't be their first single pastor, but other single pastors who served there either married right away or left abruptly. Well, I had announced to them that I wanted to remain with them for at least 20 years, or until God called me elsewhere. St. James Presbyterian Church USA has been in existence for nearly 150 years upon my arrival and had only called 6 pastors to the position of head of staff. My call getting there has its own unique story, and I'll gladly share that story with anyone who asks, but parish ministry in places like St. James comes with the normal ministerial issues. The congregation had reached a plateau with membership, even though it was deemed the largest African-American Presbyterian church in the denomination. The congregation had the issues of not having enough young adults and verified the notion that the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the ministry was done by 20% of the congregation. I mean, as I said, the congregation had the normal ministerial issues. Yet one unique quality of this congregation is that even though the membership is as large as it is, its membership comes from approximately 6 families. The congregation is on an island, and so connections to other places in Charleston are always through family connections. As a known African American congregation, local racial issues and tension has always had a place in the social justice ministry of the congregation. The evening of June 17th, 2015 was no different. It was on June 17th, only 16 days after my arrival and 11 days prior to my installation, that the Mother Emanuel massacre took place. The city was on high alert because of the nature of this dreadful crime. The group of 6 women and 3 men who had come together for weekly Bible study were killed in this mass shooting at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. The Reverend Clinton Pinckney, 41, a state senator and the pastor of Emmanuel. He was married to Jennifer Benjamin and the father of 2 children. He was a 1995 graduate of Allen University and a 1999 graduate of the University of South Carolina. Cynthia Hurd, 54, a 31-year employee of the Charleston County Public Library who managed the John L. Dart branch for 21 years before heading the St. Andrews Regional Branch, which would later bear her name. The Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, 45, a pastor at Emmanuel and a speech therapist who coached high school girls track and field at a local high school. She was the mother of 3 children, 1 in college and 2 who were students in the public school system. Tawanza Sanders, 26. A 2014 graduate in business administration from Allen University in Columbia, and a well-known young man who was committed to the building of community known as TIE. He had worked in sales at department stores such as Belk and Macy's. Ethel Lance, 70, a wonderful mother and grandmother who attended Emmanuel for most of her life and served there as a custodian as well. From 1968 to 2002, she worked as a custodian at the Charleston's Gilliard Municipal Auditorium. Susie Jackson, 87, another longtime member of Emmanuel and Ethel Lance's cousin. DePayne Milton Doctor, 49, a mother of four who sang in Emmanuel's choir, a graduate of Southern Wesleyan University where she had returned 6 months prior as an admissions coordinator at the Charleston campus. The Reverend Daniel Simmons, 74, a previous pastor of another church in the Charleston area who initially survived the attack but then died in the hospital operating room. Myra Thompson, 59, the wife of clergy at one of the local Episcopal parishes. These were the 9 who were killed, and there were others who were present that night. That night, when these precious lives were taken, was also the night that I prayed to God asking, "What have you called me to do in this?" Yeah. What was I supposed to do with this new call? It was truly overwhelming. Nothing in seminary had prepared me for this encounter. Nothing in seminary, nor in clinical pastoral education. CPE did not hook a sister up with this. Not working, y'all. Nothing gave me the answers that were needed to be a pastor in times of this type of crisis. The Reverend Clementa Pinckney was local clergy, so he had connections with my head of staff and the former associate pastor of St. James, the Reverends Charles and Carolyn Kurtz Hayward, through local clergy alliance groups. The Reverend Sherrod Coleman Singleton had coached 2 of the high school young ladies who were active members at St. James. One of Tawanza Sanders' best friends was a young adult who had been raised and holds membership in St. James. These were the direct connections that I was made aware of within the week of the shooting. God was calling me to be their pastor in the time of a crisis. One of our session members, Elder Jones, worked for the Charleston County Consolidated 911 Center as the terminal agency coordinator and was responsible for being the support to the support. Elder Jones was responsible for providing emotional support to dispatchers and call takers in times of devastation. Her work included support for those involved in the shooting death of Walter Scott, which had taken place previously that year on April the 4th, and the Mother Emanuel Massacre. In the time of crisis, God had called me to be her pastor. Another one of our session members, Elder Whaley, worked as a court administrator with the Charleston County Solicitor's Office and U.S. Attorney's Office. Her responsibility included work for the Department of Justice, coordinating services for victims of crimes recognized at the federal level. Her line of work is too sensitive to divulge any details. However, she spent very intimate moments with victims from the mass murders. God was calling me to be her pastor in the time of a crisis. In conversation with God, I was writing my womanist confession. Who God has called me to be for such a time as this was made evident to me by the work I was being called to do. I did not need to be on the front lines with the many ministers who showed up at the church dressed in their collars to be sure to be recognized and noticed. I did not need to rub elbows with the state officials who would promote the necessity of an early forgiveness image while anger boiled in the deep-seated guts of those whose families were altered. I did not need to be near or around the spotlight, but I did need to be readily available for those who needed a pastor. And if my confession of being a womanist meant anything to me, it truly meant that I needed to find a way to be committed to the wholeness and well-being of all of humanity, male and female, and especially for those who were given to me in this charge. I needed to find a way to simply be. Oh God, just let me be. How in the world can I just be when I too was so brand spanking new? I mean, I didn't even know how to get to the church from the other church. The greatest thing for me to do was to turn to the scriptures and try to figure this thing out. And I ended up in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. When he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no room for them, not even in front of the door, and he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. Use your imagination as I had to use what God had sent to me. All I had was my faith, my creativity, and my commitment, just like the 4 in the biblical account. The man was a paralytic, brought to Jesus by 4 friends. Confident that Jesus did care and could heal, the 4 friends organized and actually dug through the roof of a home where Jesus was teaching in order to bring their mutual friend with an issue to Jesus. In my imagination, the 4 friends each had specific skills. One had to be an intervener who recognized that there was a severe problem. One had to be a strategist who executed the plan for the solution. One had to be skilled with carpentry and learning how to put pulleys together, and must have been a tactical worker with practical skills. And the last one had to be a full-fledged supporter who probably stayed with the paralytic the entire time while the other 3 were working, giving him the play-by-play account of what was taking place and being the encourager to keep the faith. Well, my job is not to be the intervener who tackles the severe problem of systemic racism that sits at the root of many of the issues that paralyze the lives of black and brown bodies. That wasn't my job. My job is not to be the strategist who develops and implements the solution for our judicial system that continually paralyzes our communities with a lack of justice. But that wasn't my job. My job is not to be the skilled carpenter or a tactical worker with practical skills, because marching is great for those who can walk and stand and endure the elements, but I can't do all of that. My job was to be the full-fledged supporter, the encourager, the one who would hold the tissue when the times got tough for those who were in the fight. Kind of felt like the one that sits on the side of the ring when the boxer is boxing, shouting, "You can do it, you got it, you got it, you can do it." And when they come out, pat them down, give them some water, and they say, "Okay, going back." That was my job. As a womanist pastoring in times of crisis, you must decide which of these 4 you will be. Whatever we encounter that requires work for our souls requires us to determine our individualistic role, but to also be among the community of others who are actively working together, carrying any paralyzing issue before the one who has the ability to make a change. Are you the intervener? Are you the strategist? Are you the tactical worker with skilled abilities? Are you the encourager? Sometimes encouragement is the money that finances the stuff that happens. Don't be surprised if that's what your call is. We were told last night by Dr. Alice Walker that community is sacred. May you find medicine in this encounter with my experience. Ashe. Ashe.
Good morning, y'all. Good morning. I am so thrilled that I can say things like y'all again. It's different up there in the Northeast. Thank you. I often find myself wondering who thought it was a good idea to shred ourselves apart and then call it either holy or scholarly or necessary. Yeah. Like a dyspeptic hallelujah. Yeah. Or an off-key, That's deep. Who started this mess of believing that coming from somewhere that I call church, somewhere that is formative and life-bringing, somewhere that is maddening and destructive, somewhere that provides womanist swag and black feminist gumption and holy woman healing, somewhere that fails to live into its promises, somewhere that is human and always calling out the best and the worst in us, that somewhere that gives us transformative notions like love, hope, faith, spirit, justice, that we learn to hold fast to the good and constructive, the bass notes of courage, the cast off the you can't do that because, and then fill in the blank. Who started the demonic gatekeeping that majors in false universals, that begin with all people or all ideas, or I'm representing a neutral position, or I am universal in my thought, or real scholarship is objective. Who came up with the BS and called it the perfume of the scholarly mind? Who began this endgame of alternative fact lies as if we can divorce our minds from our bodies and our emotions from our instincts? And who, for heaven's sakes, thought progress meant dehumanizing as many people as you can get from another continent? And you ships named the Boa Morte, the Lord, the Jesus, Princess Royal, HMS Black Joke, or the Anne, this last one being owned by the U.S. Senate. And use masks, bridles, pronged collars, iron bits, shackles, branding, whipping, pepper, salt, and other hard substances on wounds, sexual assault and rape, mutilation, lynching, and burning. Who came up with the moronic caricatures like Jezebel, Mammy, Sapphire, Aunt Jemima, Black Brute, Coon, Uncle Ben, Uncle Tom, Black Buck, Jim, and Jane Crow? And wonder why from the first day that a black person was brought to the West against her or his will, we have been saying Black Lives Matter. Despite this, black people still built businesses and churches and schools and taught people regardless. And yes, they may have been and still are poor, but you know that poverty does not define your character. It only gives us an economic starting point to call out a social order that thinks it's practicing democratic capitalism, when what we've got now is an oligarchy unchecked. In short, I have grown weary of listening to excuses and rationales for creating and maintaining silos for our existence that only encourage the sideshow of our annihilation or promote our ultimate uselessness in bringing in the kingdom, the realm, the kingdom of God. I discovered years ago that the New Jerusalem does not come in a compartmentalized people who disdain one another and think that they are the only ones who hold the market on righteousness. Right. So I am glad that our assignment is to, as Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon says, to debunk, unmask, and disentangle the invitation those messages offer to us that sometimes rise to the level of command that we choose to splinter ourselves. Because being full-bodied women who know how to critique ontological suicide, move an image of salvation into place in the midst of despair, plot rebellion against the outrageous and dangerous public policies of insult and belittlement, women who practice colored orneriness in our breathing are dangerous chicks who don't mind reading the Times and calling out injustice, suspect spirituality, and dubious intellectual gibberish. Oh yes, I believe and live the indispensable triformation between town and gown, between Miss Nora, Mama Babe Mary, and baby sister Trisha, between scholarship, faith, and justice, because to do otherwise is to contribute to a status quo that was never meant for us, does little to sustain us, and means that we are always swatting at no-see-ums that distract us from the work of building our lives and helping to sustain our communities and calling out the absolute evil we see coming out of the White House. That is the whitest house that would have any of us who do not come from elite cisgendered white male privilege land cast out or trampled down, while political parties fret about winning and losing rather than governing. Right here, I digress. So I want to get back to the assignment and focus on why I do not think it's good to live a life in shreds if we can help it, and also encourage communal participation in doing so. I turn to one of the great gifts that the church, academy, and society has given to me, that is to recognize the power of hope. From the church, I learned the power of hope built on the solid rock of Jesus, and all other ground is sinking sand. From the academy, I learned that what my grandmama taught me is called a theology of hope. A hope that tells me that God suffers with us as God is also promising us a better future through the promise of the resurrection. From society, I learned hope is watching the people who helped raise me. They were perfect, imperfect people who knew the difference between survival and dumb luck. They made a way and brought others along with them. They refused to accept that the color lines in their cities made them less than, and instead built self-sustaining communities and brought forth new generations. And when urban renewal destroyed those communities in the name of progress. Side note, the slave trade developed and flourished in the name of progress also. They made sure that the projects, the southern version of urban ghettos in the north, that were built to warehouse people, were kept in pristine shape, even when it was clear that the design of these so-called renewal spaces mimicked open-air prisons and were set off from the wealthy white folks and where they lived. But because we are a trans-class people, at least back in the day we were, the black middle class was right down the street. Working class and poor white folks were right around the corner. And I bobbed to the beat of the revolution will not be televised. Nope. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white lightning, or white people. You will not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom, a tiger in your tank, or a giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with coke. The revolution will not fight the germs that may cause bad weather. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers and sisters. The revolution will be live. And for me, there can be no separation from the solid rock of Jesus, a theology of hope that believes in and demands that I work for a better future and a revolution that will be live. Why, in God's green creation, would I choose to demean any one of these spaces of nurture and hope and yes, frustration for the sake of some malformed notion of faith, intellect, or community that suggests that there should be a hierarchy of knowledge, a tote board of knowing, a Game Boy of know-how? It made no sense that I was called to teaching. When I realized when I was called to teaching, it made no sense. And now that I'm a dean of a school of teachers and learners, it makes even less sense. All of who I am and who we are should be at the welcome table of life. Yes. And I find it perplexing, if not just plain wrong, that there are some people who do not take advantage of the rich playing field it gives us when we combine faith, intellect, and community in the work we do. Be it in classrooms or town halls or sanctuaries. The simple fact is this. It's hard out there for a black woman, no matter where our home space may be. And if we believe and live the threadbare lie that there is an inevitable and irreparable split between the church and the academy and society, and that this is the natural and normal state of things, and if we deceive ourselves or allow others to convince us that we are not smart enough, spiritual enough, strategic enough to know how to prophetically shapeshift into a womanish whole who lives with colored orneriness to the glory of God, then this only means that we have more work to do. Because we live in a time in which the bone-deep hope I learned from town and gown, from academy, church, and society, means that we must be theological fabulous and get God up doing a standing ovation in creation by working together from wherever God has planted us to grow to refuse the complete inanity of southern border walls, travel bans, police brutality, repealing affordable and accessible health care, thoughtless defenses of the Second Amendment, signing legislation that encourages pollution and further destroying our environment, military parades, immigration policies that are just mean and vile and serve little purpose other than to make folks who are scared of difference feel more better. Rolling back voting rights, exploiting workers, inadequate census data, doing the nay-nay with white supremacists, and sanctifying sexism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and more. Because sisters and a few brothers who are here, because we are not being called to be the poster children for the status quo of the state, or to practice an over-religified solipsistic matterhorn, surrounded by the chants of inept kumbayas and sashaying alleluias, and then starring in a weary drama of an outdated carousel of momentary ecstasies. Ashe.
You good? No, you good? Nope. Yep.
Also,
themes after Dr. Townsend's remarks. I am honored to join this panel. It is truly a blessing to reconnect with so many colleagues and friends who have encouraged me along this journey of tri-vocational ministry as a biblical scholar, professor, and teacher, and also pastoral leader. In these remarks, I'll offer an overview of my research and writing, how it has evolved, and how through it all, the church has been the incubator or the space of praxis for these multiple callings I've been living to come to fruition. Before going any further, I'd like to just take some time to thank our visionary leader, Dr. Katie Cannon, for keeping the faith, for calling us together, and for rallying the resources that we need in order to do this type of womanist work. And I'm also grateful for Dr. Allison Guys Johnson for her collaborative and visionary spirit. It's so good to see these two schools coming together, and so the leadership that has made this possible. Dr. Blunt and Dr. Walker, thank you for all that you're doing to advance and support us in advancing womanist scholarship in this Center for Womanist Leadership. It was in 1991, over 25 years ago, when I took my first course on womanist theology, offered at Union Theological Seminary and taught by Dr. Dolores Williams. Say her name. As we covered topics dealing with the sources and experiences of Black women, the distinctiveness of womanist God talk, and the multiple forms of oppression and marginalization that keep Black women's experiences from being recognized or acknowledged in mainstream theological discourses, I was excited to finally have language that gave me a way to better understand the different influences that led me into ministry. The folks in my community identified early on that I was interested in grown-up doings. And I was wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for oneself. So after a lot of doubting and resisting, I finally began a journey of preparation for ministry at Union Theological Seminary. Although I learned about Black theology from Dr. James Cone and Black church history from my professor of blessed memory, Dr. James Melvin Washington, it wasn't until I sat under the emancipatory teaching of Dr. Dolores Williams and began to read Womanist Ethics and Theology, and realized that until I grappled with the intersectional realities of gender, race, and class, then all the theology and all the ethics and all the history and all the exegesis and biblical hermeneutics, even if it carried the label of African Americans or Blacks in the Bible, would not lead me into a viable trajectory of research and scholarship, nor would any of this biblical scholarship find traction in the communities of accountability that had nurtured me into ministry. Indeed, it was in my womanist theology class under Dr. Dolores Williams and other classes and teaching moments I had with Dr. Clarice Martin and Dr. Renita Weems that I was able to begin to carve out my own interpretive framework for understanding Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Blacks in early Christian writings through the development of a taxonomy of ethno-political rhetoric that revealed how early Christians used these ethnic groups to construct perceptions about vices and sins, sexual immorality, and insiders and outsiders. In symbolic blackness and ethnic difference, I wish I could get that little piece out of the corner, but you can see the nature of the slide. In symbolic blackness and ethnic difference in early Christianity, I argue that although it appears on the surface that Christianity is to extend to the ends of the world and embodied symbolically by the Ethiopian, in actuality, those referred to by this ethnic nomenclature were being rendered invisible and silent. They were effectively being blackened by their sins. Thus, I have lectured and written several articles that call attention to the importance of the Axumite Empire for the study of the New Testament, so that students and other interpreters may become more aware of the diverse historical and cultural background of early Christianity. So I take my students right in intro New Testament courses to Ethiopia. Even as we talk about Rome and the Roman Empire, there was also Axum and the Axumite Empire. And it is this notion of redrawing the boundaries of early Christianity that has enabled me to find my own place and my own voice in New Testament studies. Thank you. And so as we know, for the most part, everything centers around the Mediterranean and the Roman Empire. And instead of just doing extra or elective courses on the Nile Valley region and the Axumite Empire, I have become far more intentional about bringing the land of the Axumites, the land of the Nubians, and the land of North Africans directly into our core introductory New Testament course. It's this notion of redrawing boundaries and even removing these boundaries that keep our lands and peoples separated from one another that has now given me a focus as a New Testament scholar. And furthermore, I've come to realize that it is important for us to go beyond canonical biblical scholars in our research. And so what drew me to Howard University, and people often ask, why did you go to Howard? But the point of the matter is, many of our historically black colleges and universities house repositories of sources and material that we don't have access to. And so though I ventured there for administrative leadership as an associate dean for academic affairs, God had other plans. And God enabled me to become involved in this delegation and this effort to return this very manuscript that's on the screen now, the Acts of Paul, the Gaynell Paulus, in the Ge'ez language, it's the Gaynell Paulus. We returned this manuscript 2 years ago back to Ethiopia. And so, at this point, it is important that we begin to tell our stories. As I often do when going around and sharing about womanist theology and womanist biblical hermeneutics, this material, as you all know, and most of you know, of course, in this room, is not new.
Right.
Back in the mid-'80s, it was entrenched in the guild, if you will, through the American Academy of Religion and also in the Society of Biblical Literature. But this has now been 30 years or more within the formal study, within theological education of this material. So it's not new. However, there's still a big disconnect between what goes on in the academy and how our scholarship lands in the church. And so I'm grateful for the opportunities to be able to share this scholarship, and I'm also grateful for this collaborative project that is this volume that came out in 2016, Womanist Interpretations of the Bible, Expanding the Discourse. Because in this volume now, we have ways of looking more intentionally at the various trajectories of womanist biblical scholarship. And so in this volume, Dr. Vanessa Lovelace and I identified themes of gender and sexuality, agency and advocacy, women on the margins, and illuminating children and childhood experiences. So this volume is organized into 4 parts dealing with gender and sexuality, agency and advocacy, women on the margins, and children and childhood. Now my particular piece in this volume deals with Black bibliophiles. And I'm going to just put that phrase out there so we can begin to think about the African American and people of the African diaspora, the impact that these collectors and keepers of tradition offer us. Black bibliophiles are women such as Dorothy Porter Wesley, who, if it was not for Dorothy Porter Wesley, there would not be a Moreland Spoonarm Research Center at Howard University. Mamie Clayton of California, who was a librarian and collected over many, many years this huge collection that is now in the Mamie Clayton Museum in Los Angeles. And there's Vivian Harsh. I think it's important for us to know of these Black bibliophiles, as we call them, whose collection is now in the Carter G. Woodson collection in the Chicago Public Library. It is through these Black bibliophiles, right? Dr. Charles Wright in Detroit, the African American Museum in Detroit was funded and founded by Dr. Charles Wright. And even at Howard University, our collection of Ethiopic artifacts and manuscripts was a donation in 1993 by Dr. Andre Reynolds Tweed. He was a graduate of Howard's Medical School. And it is these Black bibliophiles that paved the way for this scholarship that is now emerging and our efforts to return the manuscript to the Deborah Libanos Monastery in Ethiopia. And I just want to put up a couple slides just to show the, just a snapshot. This is only a brief opportunity to share this material. But I would have been remiss not to at least bring this trajectory of scholarship that is taking shape. And I'm hoping in some way that pastors and clergy leaders, community activists, and others can begin to collaborate more creatively on how we can share this material in our communities. So getting back to telling our stories, this book, Womanist Interpretations of the Bible, the most important part about this book is the subtitle. And it's that notion of expanding the discourse. This is where we stand now, this opportunity to expand the discourse, but not only in expanding the discourse, we're changing the discourse, even displacing the discourse, and also replacing these traditional categories and notions of objectivity and ways of doing biblical scholarship. When Dr. Vanessa Lovelace and I conceived of this volume, it was a result of my experiences in the Guild of the Academy. I was on the Samaya Studies editorial board, and as a member of that board, I wanted to ensure that there was something within the Society of Biblical Literature that honored the work and the history of womanist theology and now womanist biblical scholarship. However, the more Dr. Lovelace and I worked together on this project, and there are many contributors to the volume who are gathered at this conference, we realized and we wanted to acknowledge our shared commitments to the church. And the women, men, and children, both Dr. Lovelace and I have sons, and the book is actually dedicated to our young men, this womanist conversation is not just for us and the choir who gets it, but it's for our male colleagues and our sons and others who are coming and ushering in this new generation of engagement. So this book was written for the church, for women and men and children we deal with in our daily lives, and especially for those who don't see the possibilities for using the Bible in your everyday work. And so often we would think, okay, let's just get on the streets and go out and do our marches and our activism. But it's still important to have these sources accessible. But the sources must be relevant for our experiences. So, in the spirit of Alice Walker, this volume demonstrates that womanist biblical critics are responsible for and in charge of leading an interpretive paradigm shift that invites others from different disciplines to engage biblical criticism and exposes the hypocrisy, misogyny, homophobia that is still lingering in our churches today. In terms of this material, we've had a chance to share it in different contexts, and I was extremely happy to be able to share this material with a group of debutantes at Elitist Baptist Church. I won't call any names in the Washington, D.C. area. I won't do it. I'm not going to even call the street or the corner. Yeah. But I've also shared this volume in the D.C. jail. And an inside-out program where half the students were seminarians and the other half in the class were residents in transition, getting ready for re-entry into our communities. And so this extreme of how we are still trying to raise our daughters and how we are dealing with the contemporary slavery of mass incarceration is represented in this volume. So as I bring closure to these remarks, I've been reflecting on this notion of being a scholar, being a teacher, but every step of the way I have never lost sight of being called by God to bear witness in the church. It was the church that gave rise to my budding questions and intellect and curiosity. It was the church in Detroit, Michigan, where Dr. Frederick Sampson was the pastor, who at that time hadn't brought a woman pastor even to his pulpit, but he certainly encouraged me to move forward in my ministry. It was the church under the leadership of Dr. Sharon Williams in Brooklyn, New York. Once I arrived in New York City and trying to make sense out of everything that was going on, the church and the pastors and the leaders of the church and the mothers of the church were always with me every step of the way. It was the church, Dr. Linton Gunn in Harlem, New York. As I'm in Morningside Heights at Columbia and Union Seminary, I would find my way to Harlem to stay grounded and to make sense out of all that material I was learning. And so the church is this place that continues to call us into accountability. And even last night, a group of clergy leaders from the PC, the Presbyterian Church USA, met, and we're already strategizing and coming up with ways of how to move the next publication and this next project, and where do we take these conversations that we have. It's the church and the academy that comes together to continue to expand our discourses. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to share a bit on this panel, and I'm thankful for this Womanist Leadership Center that enables us to have these kinds of conversations and plants the seeds for our own gardens to continue to grow. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. I too echo the acknowledgments that have already been offered by this brilliant panel, women. I'm just glad to be here. I'm just glad to be here first at the invitation of Dr. Cannon, and then alongside women who have been so integral to my own formation as a womanist theological ethicist. So I'm going to offer to you today some very preliminary thoughts in consideration of the theme that Dr. Cannon has given us for this panel. And from the title, Blood Memory, a Black Womanist Requiem for the Mourner's Bench. I do not remember his name, but I vividly recall that he was blood. Not as in kin, but as in the member of the original blood family. The street gang, formed in 1972 Los Angeles in response to escalating community violence and intimidation. But on that early 2000s Saturday, he was also dead. And I was in New Jersey, having arrived at the Union Baptist Church in Montclair to funeralize a 16-year-old black boy who had been killed according to the logics of his gang affiliation. It was my first funeral as a pulpit minister. And now, approximately 15 years later, having funeralized hundreds upon hundreds of black people, sometimes multiple in one day, I regrettably do not remember his name. But I vividly recall the typically struggling to be half-full sanctuary being filled past overflow on this particular day with black youth, predominantly Blood and Ruby, their female counterparts, who were bereaved, enraged, undone, and of course adorned in red. As the eulogist ascended the pulpit, and as I literally stared into a red sea of black children, I remember thinking to myself, I have never in my entire life seen this many young people in the church. And that's when it happened. The eulogist, likely in his effort to assuage grief, but more precisely as evidence of his own Trinitarian malformation that necessarily requires the subordination of persons in the Godhead, the divine economy, namely the subordination of the Christ to the Creator as evidence of the sacrality of subordination of persons in the political economy. The eulogist said with conviction to this overflowing room of black youth who were blood, quote, "Without the shedding of blood, there can be no remission of sin." I flinched. I was barely 21 years old, barely a seminarian. I had barely been introduced to the deep wells of womanism. And unbeknownst to me at that time, I was on the precipice of being completely chewed out and morally obliterated by the then pastor and other pulpit associates for wearing pants and dangling earrings in the pulpit. I was without words, without the reason, without the ecclesial gravitas to interrupt the project of pastoral death dealing happening at that moment. And yet, in that moment, it was Walker's Miss Sophia, who my mother introduced me to when I was but a womanish girl, who tarried with me and gave utterance in my spirit to a resounding hell no. In approaching the theme of this morning's panel, the indispensable triformation between gown and town, as it relates to the immutable intersections between church, academy, and society for the Black Womanist Theological Project, I begin with the funeral as blood memory, as both a literal signifier of my professional beginnings in the parish, as well as a figurative indicator of what dancer and choreographer Alvin Ailey formerly used to describe the stories that live in our bodies without explicit recollection and that compel our movement in the world. I start here with the funeral as blood memory, literally and figuratively, precisely because for as much as the nexus of church, academy, and society marks space for Black womanist reproductive work beyond the cishet proclivities of Victorian domesticity, the nexus of this triformation, as well as each site respectively, have simultaneously functioned as spaces that promote the destruction of women. Of course, we are familiar with womanist thinkers, or at least we ought to be, with womanist religious thinkers like Cheryl Townsend Gillis and Carrie Day, as well as Black religionists like Marla Fredericks and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who read Black churches as women's spaces and or as spaces with great potential for approximating Black women's thriving. Following the cue, however, of womanist thinkers like Dolores S. Williams, Emilie M. Towns, Kelly Brown Douglas, and Marcia Y. Riggs, my theoethical inquiry has been largely directed by the primary moral failure of Black churches, especially as they reproduce sexual gender injustice against Black women and girls. Echoing Black feminist theorist Salamisha Tlaib's discussion of peculiar citizenships and the fundamental paradoxes of institutional belonging that highlights the interior estrangement of marginalized intra-communities, even while experientially concurring with the meta-narrative of the Black church as the place where Black women have, I'm quoting you, Dr. Riggs, come to know a God of justice and love. It must also be noted that Black churches have functioned as incubators for bastardized hermeneutics and theological imagination that serve to demonize those who deviate from the constructed normativity of the arbiters of power, who are typically Black cis men who perform heterosexuality in public. Incubators of evil that manifest manifest in men and women who perform as patriarchs in their perfect submission to the socially constructed myths of bodily hierarchies propelled by black woman hate. That is, the sacralized deployment of which consistently bombards black women with Afro-ecclesial realities that morally deviate from the prophetic claims of freedom, justice, black anthropological principle, and black bodily integrity that emanate from the origins of the black church as slave religion. And necessarily expands upon the triangulation of black women's oppression presented via Williams Haywood-Riddick emphasis and its attention to the scourge of the nexus of white supremacy and male superiority. In other words, we hate against ourselves. And that's what Dr. Walker was trying to point us to in some way last night. In fact, less than 2 weeks ago, Facebook was lit with video footage of the physical assault of 22-year-old Audrey Stevenson at the Potter's House, Fort Worth Church, a satellite ministry of TDJ. Now, while the theological and ethical rationale for identifying the Potter's House as a black church in the first place is arguable, its leadership by and constituency of persons of African descent lends credibility to the claim of membership among what Dolores Williams might concede as the African American institutional churches or denominational churches. The dispute ensued over whether or not Audrey could serve in her volunteer ministry capacity on that day. Rhonda Lewis, a church elder and the church administrator who was accompanied by Brandon Amy, a church security officer, informed Audrey that she had been sat down, that is, barred from leadership in church activities. And according to the footage and numerous media reports, a heated verbal exchange followed wherein Audrey attempted to gain clarity about her being sat down, in contradistinction to a recent conversation she had had with church leadership about the status of her service to the church, which she understood to be unrestricted. Amidst the verbal exchange, Audrey did call the administrator a liar, and she did tell her that she should be ashamed of herself. But things got physical when Audrey tried to leave the room. Brandon Amy, the church security officer, blocked her path, saying that he needed to explain something to her. And as she begged him to let her leave, she was physically accosted, manhandled, handcuffed, and indicated between cries and screams that Amy, the man, the security officer, had his knee in her back. All because she allegedly, quote, refused to follow the systems established by the church administrator, quote. For as much as we ought to be alarmed by such physical assault of black women in black churches, this merely proceeds as one example among many of the everydayness of acts of physical, moral, and theological violence against black women. Acts that are as much complicated intracommunally as they are intercommunally by the hexagonal dimensionality of the least that is propelled by the subordinate status applied to race, gender, class, sexual, religious, and generational indicators. In line with the critical race scholarship of Patricia J. Williams, one could just as easily point beyond the church to say the academic imperial project and the ways in which its psychological, body, and cultural violence of racism and racial hostility that, for instance, occasionally demands that black women professors lie face down on the concrete while campus police put a knee in their back while validating their school ID. Deployed through the widespread and oft-intentional everydayness of white domination across class boundaries for the Bernie bros in the room, also manifests, y'all will catch that later, the complexities of gendered racism and the uneven intellectual geographies that it presumes. For black women, this means that while having to deal intracommunally with the self-sarcographic, that is, self-cannibalizing practices and consequences of social subjection that take form out of the colonial logics that guide the white male imagination, black women have to deal with these white women too. In her essence, Black Guy, the white face of multiculturalism and the violence of the academic imperial project, Delia D. Douglas argues that white women's denial of how race and class shape differences among women exposes their complicity in the reproduction of racial power. Douglas's argument echoes Bell Hook's assertion of the, quote, inability of white women to get a handle on the meaning of whiteness in their lives, end quote, such that they dismissively assert shared feminist identity in ways that brutally displace, silence, and worse yet, erase black women as if, Dr. Cannon, the black woman's story were not true. Given that data indicates that the majority of women hired in post-secondary institutions, inclusive of freestanding seminaries and university-based divinity schools, are white, able-bodied women, it's easy to see how white women as the beneficiaries of disproportionate, though unstated, informal processes of affirmative selection that intimate concern for diversity are regularly complicit in maintaining the ivory tower's white racial status quo, where the visibility of the black woman's project, approximately 35 years post-nascence, consistently stands on trial, insofar as it is required to prove the pedagogical value of its episteme, its ontology, its praxis, and its vision over and over again. To be sure, such violent dispossession of black women in church and academy is the shadow work of state-sanctioned violence, resonating, in fact, with a Marcia Riggs subordinate determinative institutional dialectic that she proffers in her Plenty Good Room. The violent dispossession of black women in church and academy is the shadow work of state-sanctioned violence, which, in the form of police brutality, not only deploys extreme and unnecessary force in ways that willfully inflict pain and or death on black women, like 28-year-old Sandra Bland, 30-year-old Charlene Elias, 37-year-old Tanisha Anderson, 47-year-old Yvette Smith, 34-year-old Miriam Carey, 27-year-old Shelley Fry, 16-year-old Darnisha Harris, 30-year-old Melissa Williams, 35-year-old Alicia Thomas, 23-year-old Chantel Davis, 22-year-old Rakia Boyd, 26-year-old Tarika Wilson, 57-year-old Alberta Spruitt, 92-year-old Katherine Johnston, and 7-year-old Ayanna Stanley Jones. Not only does it willfully inflict pain and or death on black women, but it also secondarily inflicts pain and living death on black women who are left behind to mourn. While death is a regular outcome of state-sanctioned violence, it is also constituted by harassment, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, profiling, racialized surveillance, and false arrest. And among women, black women and girls are excessively represented as casualties of not only state-sanctioned violence, but domestic violence as well. The oft-unchallenged patterns and practices that undergird the systemic criminalization of black women and girls and the ethic of mass incarceration that beleaguers black communities more broadly destroy black women's lives. In direct opposition to its primary task violent policing pathologizes power through the inversion of the principal function of law enforcement. Police brutality exposes the interdigitation of structural and interpersonal violence against Black women in ways that mirror violence against Black women in the church and academy. In the first place, as with violent pastoring, the distorted aims of violent policing obliterate the fundamental liberty, the active, dynamic determination of self by the human person. Or in the language of M. Sean Copeland, it destroys Black women's humanism. Such structural violence is not only somatic in its destructive potential, as in affecting the flesh, but it has profound spiritual implications as it endeavors to annihilate the soul, inasmuch as it breeds despair, hopelessness, and rage that parallels the academic angst and anxiety that lends fantastic hegemonic incredibility to the caricature of the mad Black woman that keeps so many of our colleagues in triformation laughing at us. Moreover, as a womanist religious community, we have not even begun to adequately toe the line in theory or theological vision concerning the least of the least among us, Black trans women, and the ways in which the compounded nature of Black trans women's radical defiance of the liberal phenomenon of making men, which ironically endeavors to combat the modern project of Black bodily degradation even while failing with flair, not only makes some of us shiver this idea of Black trans women as women, not only makes some of us shiver in concert with the not woman cries of radical white feminisms that defecate on the traditional communalism at the heart of Walker's intention, but marks the respective scenes of Black genderqueer, non-binary, trans subjection with multiple and complex jeopardies within the triformation of gown and town, which we are not ready to wear or step out in, but that makes sense of the suicide falls that guide the choreographic imaginations of housefall communities around the nation and the world. Since it is the case that I slay, you slay, we slay, or as scripturally attested, as in Adam all die. That is, since it is the case that the funeral makes perfect sense in its function as the fulcrum of church, academy, and society, precisely because of the kinds of deaths visited upon Black women in the triformation of gown and town. The question remains for me, what about this nexus of gown and town and its presupposition of indispensability? Why can't we just throw the damn gown away? And the pantyhose and the police. Why would so many Black women who self-identify as women choose to live here at the interstices of a sexist church, a racist academy, and a racist, sexist, cishet capitalist society, amidst the fragments of a bridge called our mother's back and an ocean of our sisters' tears? Why would we choose to live here? Especially in light of the fact that Walker's definition offers Black women explicit license to their assumption of periodic separatism for reasons of health. Why the compulsion toward triformation when such unity seemingly mandates Black women's further fragmentation? Here is where I find the metaphoric value of requiem, as opposed to dirge, in relation to the mourner's bench. The mourner's bench, which is at once both pedestrian, as in the blood memory that advances this reflection, as much as it is choreographed, as in Tally Beattie's famous ballet, The Mourner's Bench. Y'all will have to look that up on YouTube. I find the Requiem in relation to The Mourner's Bench to be instructive. The relation between Requiem as that which calls us to remember what is the case, and the Mourner's Bench, which calls us into what ought to be the case, but is not yet. Whereas a dirge is a mournful song of lament for the dead, a requiem is a musical composition as token of remembrance of the dead. And while the two are not inherently mutually exclusive, the distinction between lament and remembrance is ever so significant. For while lament demands weeping and mourning and despair, remembrance opens space for a variety of moral postures in the face of contemporary crucifixions that live into the valuing of tears as a natural counterbalance of laughter. Remembrance, read Christologically, as in, do this in remembrance of me, allows for the telling of the story in another way, such that our participation doing this, our participation in the story, might shift lament toward its natural counterbalance of laughter, which is not merely indicative of humor, but of abiding black joy that hopes at Golgotha. This was the missed moment of that Saturday morning in a New Jersey church. Womanist theological and theoethical work is the Requiem. It is the very act of remembrance as the site of theological inquiry. It is Katie Cannon's confession of her pathway to transforming the theological academy, church, and world, as she explained to the Society for the Study of Black Religion a few years ago, quote, "I became a revolutionary because I wanted to know what made white people treat black people so terrible," end quote. Womanist theology and theoethical inquiry is the Requiem. It is the Requiem, the very act of remembrance at the site of terribleness, at the site of theological inquiry, that decidedly answers the question, why? The question of why, of the indispensability of the continuity of church, academy, and society that is before us today. Whether we turn to Sean Copeland's animetic imperative that encourages black women to wade, not drown, through many sorrows, or whether we turn to Cannon's literary method that exhorts us to remember what we never knew, or whether we turn to Towns's moral historiographies that challenge us to attend to the true, the almost true, and the sometimes true stories of black women's lives, it is in the act of remembering, the act of requiem, of those things that Toni Morrison tells us are too terrible to relate, that we participate as womanists in Walker's creativity, unearthing the utterance of Miss Sophia, who is also Jerraine Lee, who is also Mariah Stewart, who is also Ida Wells Barnett, who is also Zora Neale Hurston, who is also Ella Baker, who is also Grandma and Nana and Auntie and Ma Dear and Big Mama and them. Women whose life and witness in community, that's society, The women whose life and witness society in the spirit. That is a womanist pneumatological intervention that is inclusive of the church, even as its inclusivity extends to other sites of Black women's religious belonging and spiritual practice, right? So, the women whose life and witness society in the spirit, church, embody demands for the story to be told, academic profession, another way, have authorized with their flesh and blood the indispensable unity of the tri-formation of gown and tam, which while Adam is in fact dying, for as in Adam we all die, declares with a dissenting hell no the imminent transformative potential and mandate of telling the story another way. As in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. Telling the story, even so all shall be made alive. Such indispensability then grows in our mother's gardens. It is work to tend to it, to tend to the counterbalancing of tears and laughter, of lament and remembrance, and yet the choice is ours to make. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. In closing, a Black womanist theological aesthetics loves the spirit and considers its ultimacy in light of and or as perceived through sensory experience and episteme, as well as rigorous interrogation of the beautiful that resides in the ethical apocalyptic significance of the aesthetic anthropological claim Black is beautiful, and also considers Black and Black feminist womanist art forms. Black womanist theological aesthetics is primarily guided by three intersecting presuppositions, namely Blackness as the primary character of divine beauty, critical memory of Black women's bodies as spectacle of subjectivity, and Black performance art as an aesthetic mechanism of survival and liberation that challenges race-gendered projections by embodying the insurgency of dissent. A Black womanist theological aesthetics employs the work of womanist requiem as a call into or out of blood memory. That is the stories that linger in our flesh. To recollect the movement that happens at the mourner's bench among those whose names we don't remember, but who are our kin and who we know remain in a Red Sea, not having seen the promise. We look there to the mourner's bench. We remember then at the mourner's bench. We go to the mourner's bench as a theoethical site of inquiry that indicates not the certain death so often prescribed for Black women and those they love by the arbiters of church, academy, and society, but the enfleshed logic of Black women's even so. This is womanist work, and it's my next stop in the town, in my gown, both clerical and hooded. Thank you.
I knew that one day, let's see, I'm sitting, what am I doing here? close this down? This is what happens when you old. Oh, now just set it down so it doesn't. Well, I knew that I would have to pay one day for being a black Episcopalian. Who knew that it would be my womanist sisters who would make me pay? Here I have to bring up the rear of this. So when things get to going south, just say, oh yeah, she's Episcopalian. That which is a curse will be an excuse. It is wonderful to be here with you today and see so many friends and colleagues and those whose work and lives and ministries inspire me to keep on keeping on. And to be with these women, well now, that just doesn't make sense. What does it mean to be a womanist theologian, bringing together the academy, the church, and society? The answer to this question for me is found in the journey that brings me to this very place. This is a journey that begins with an incident from my childhood, that at this point in time, I don't know whether it was real or a dream. But now it doesn't really matter because of the impact it has had on my life, in my journey as a womanist theologian. And that impact has been great. And so I have spoken about it before, but I will share it again here with you today in trying to answer this question of what it means to be a womanist theologian living in the nexus of academy, church, and society. When I was about 7 years old, I remember riding through the so-called inner city of Dayton, Ohio, my hometown, with my parents. Now what commends this incident to being a dream and not reality is that I was sitting by the window in the back seat of the car, not on the hump in the middle of the back seat, as was always the case since I was the middle child in the family, which did not grant me the privilege of a window. Nevertheless, it was a rainy evening. I looked out the window of the car and noticed a little boy and girl, I imagined them as brother and sister, crossing the street. They were disheveled, dirty, and not properly dressed for the rainy weather. To my 7-year-old eye, they looked as if they might be hungry. They looked poor. I literally cried at the sight of them and the thought of how they might have to live. In the midst of my tears, I made a vow that day to one day come back and rescue those children from what I believe to be a poverty-stricken life. Initially, I imagined that I would grow up and that they would stay little, and that I would become a teacher and literally go back and help those children in some way. As I got older, moving toward college, I had visions of becoming a lawyer. Some of you may remember, and if you're willing to admit, a short-lived television show in 1970 called Storefront Lawyers. This show was about a group of lawyers committed to pro bono work. I thought to myself, that's it. I'm going to become a storefront lawyer. My commitment to get back to those children was as strong as ever, and it had now grown into a sense of accountability. I held myself accountable to those who, by no fault of their own, were forced to live on the margins of society, struggling to navigate and negotiate a life through a complexity of injustice that thwarted their very ability to enjoy the abundance of life that God promises us all. An abundance which means the ability to live into the fullness of whomever God has created us to be in all of our sacred, gendered, ethnic, racial, sexually expressive, overall richly human uniqueness. And so I started out in college to become a lawyer. Now, before I continue, there is another thread to the story and the journey that I must pick up, and that is the thread that is the church. I grew up, as I've just alluded to, in a black Episcopal church in Dayton. It was called St. Margaret's. The priest of that church was Father Cochran. He baptized me, presented me to confirmation, and eventually, well into his 80s and during his retirement, presented me to ordination to the priesthood. Growing up, I loved the church. Every Sunday, with rare exceptions, I would wake my parents up to ask them to take me to church if they themselves weren't going that day. And of course, that received the anger of my two sisters and my brother. They would do like this to me. I would go to the 8 o'clock service, then attend Sunday school, and then stay for the 11 o'clock. You all say, but as an Episcopalian, you was out by noon. No sacrifice, I got to see. We always say, if the Spirit don't get there within the hour, you're wasting your time and the Spirit's time. Now, one of the reasons that I liked the church was because I loved hearing the stories about Jesus. And to me, one of the saddest stories of all was the Christmas story. I simply could not understand as a child how people could allow a baby to be born in a manger in a barn. That story often, and I mean this literally, made me cry. The baby Jesus in my young mind was no different than those little children that I had encountered crossing the street. So early on, I understood there to be some kind of relationship between Jesus and those children, to Jesus and the poor and the marginalized. As time went on, it would be this relationship that I would find myself continuing to try to figure out. For indeed, by the time I got to college, I really wanted to know what God had to do with it all. How, I wondered, could God allow for such injustice, which at this point was defined for me through the lens of race? For I quite understood the reality of white racism from my own life experiences and from the way of life that was black suffering. I wondered what God had to do with it. I wondered why this God, for whom nothing was impossible, didn't do something about racism. At that point, I wanted God to do something about white people. It was a moment of crisis. A crisis of faith. And this is where, for me, it was about my senior year, really, of college, that theology began. Indeed, this is, in fact, where all theological reflection begins. Theology is not a matter of the head. It is a matter of faith. We don't do theology because we are sitting around with nothing else to do, and so we suddenly begin to think, what is God like in the Godhead? Or what's that Trinity all about? Or what's homoousia? I don't think so. No theology begins that way. Theology begins with questions of contradiction, which lead to crises, as in opportunities for faith. For let's be real, we rarely engage in sustained theological reflection when everything is going well. We simply proclaim, God is good all the time, and all the time God is good. And then we move on. No. It is when things are not going the way our faith suggests they should go. When things are not going well, that is when the theological questions emerge. For instance, what does it mean to talk about the love of God in the midst of the unremitting hate of white supremacy that is anti-blackness? What does it mean to talk about the compassion of God in the light of the masculine insecurity that is misogyny? How are we to talk about the peace of God that is justice in the light of the homophobic fear, meaning the homophobes fear that he or she may not be what they pretend to be? What does it mean to talk about that justice of God in light of the homophobic fear that is heterosexist and transphobic terrorizing? And how are we to talk about the God of the oppressed in light of the it's all about me too-ness of white feminism that is What does it mean to speak of the freedom of God in a world and society riddled with the systemic and structural legacy of slavery that is poverty, mass incarceration, and death? In this regard, theology is, as German theologian Karl Barth said, faith seeking understanding. And so it is that my road to here as a womanist theologian has been about seeking to understand the meaning of my faith, the meaning of God's very revelation in Jesus, the meaning of that in light of the lives of those little children that I encountered so many years ago. It is about doing theology, again in the words of Barth, with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Now let me pause again for a moment and say something about this faith that I seek to understand. This is the faith of my maternal grandmother, a poor black woman from the South who made her way up from Georgia to Columbus, Ohio during the time of the Great Migrations. All the time that I knew her, she was an elevator operator at the Columbus, Ohio post office. Now, some of you may remember elevator operators. They were the women, because they were typically women, who sat inside the elevator. You would literally ring a bell, and the elevator would come to you, and then there was someone sitting inside who would crank open the gate, then crank open the door, and then ask you what floor you wanted to go to. That person was my grandmother. Now, she had a dream. She had a dream that her 4 grandchildren would one day finish high school. She couldn't dream a dream of anything more for her, as she would call it, 4 colored children. She would set aside money each week from her meager paycheck for her children to receive upon our completion of high school. Unfortunately, she died relatively young and didn't live to see any of us finish high school. But I know she must now be jumping up and down in her grave, as all 4 of her grandchildren went on to complete terminal degrees in our respective fields. Now, just as I remember your dream for us, I never remember a time when she did not end her day by sitting on the front porch with a bowl of rice, a cup of coffee, and the Bible. And so my theological journey has been seeking to understand my grandmother's faith in light of the marginalized realities of far too many Black children. My womanist theological journey has been, in essence, about a search for my grandmother's garden of faith. And so, what has this meant practically for me? It has meant that it is the struggles for life and wholeness in light of the complex realities of injustices that poor Black children have to navigate every day in this country that inform my theological questions and the theology I do. Sometimes those questions are more personal than at other times, as was the case in my most recent book, Stand Your Ground.
Yeah.
For as I continue to witness the deaths of Trayvon, Jordan, Renisha, Jonathan, and others, my fear for the life of my own son intensified. And so I wanted to know not only why, as I asked my father some 55 years ago, why white people hated us so, but I wanted to know what God had to do with it. And hence, stand your ground. This is a theological question that I continue to pursue. For now, it is for me a question of violence. Let me say a word about what this looks like as I am in the midst of this theological journey of trying to figure it all out. So, what does such a theology look like for me today? It begins with the refrain, "Stop the violence," heard across this country in response to the high incidence, particularly of gun violence, that has plagued the nation, most notably in our schools. What I have recognized is that often ignored is the unremitting violence that threatens the well-being and lives of Black and brown people every day, especially in our children. This is the violence of white supremacy. Make no mistake about it. This white supremacist narrative is central to our nation's founding identity and continues to shape our nation's collective consciousness. This narrative promotes the superiority of whiteness by characteristically negating, as you all know, the humanity of those deemed non-white, most notably brown and Black people. As such, therefore, it is inherently violent. Any ideology or system of thought that objectifies or demeans the sacred dignity of another human being is violent. Moreover, such a system of thought inevitably initiates a cycle of violence. Such is the case with white supremacy, as, for instance, it disproportionately traps Black and brown bodies in a violent cycle, such as the cycle of poverty. 18% of our nation's children live in households that subsist below the poverty line, with children of color being disproportionately impacted. In 2016, nearly 1 in 3 Black children, along with 1 in 3 American Indian, Alaskan Native children, and more than 1 in 4 Latinx children, compared to 1 in 9 white children, were poor, living in poverty. Worse yet, approximately 1 in 6 Black children, along with 1 in 6 American Indian and Alaska Native children, and 1 in 10 Latinx children, compared to 1 in 20 white children, were living in extreme poverty. Poverty is considered the single greatest threat to children's well-being. It impedes learning and contributes to social behavioral problems and poor mental health. Poverty is a reality of crucifying violence that fosters death, not life. In this regard, the gun violence that spills out into our streets and into our schools is far too often simply the violence that violence has created. The point of the matter is this: our nation, if not world, is saturated with a violent narrative of white supremacy that violates the sacred humanity and devalues the life of women, men, and children, especially those of color. And so what does theology have to do with this? Well, here's what I'm trying to figure out. Christianity's central symbol, the cross, reflects the depth and scope of human violence. It points to a world that is steeped in violence. Through Jesus, God enters into this world of violence and yet is not compromised by it. Indeed, God triumphs over the violence of the cross, the violence of the world in a non-violent, life-affirming way. Specifically through the resurrection, God affirms the utter inviolability of human life. Essentially, the cross resurrection event reflects the justice of God. For God's justice is nothing less than a defeat of all that betrays the sacred dignity and life of any human being. Furthermore, it matters that Jesus was crucified. His crucifixion indicates God's unwavering solidarity with the crucified peoples of the world, making unmistakably clear that these lives matter to God. Even more, the crucified Jesus' resurrection reveals that it is only when the sacred dignity of those whose lives are most beset by crucifying violence, it's only when their lives are restored and their dignity is restored, it is then that the justice of God can be realized. Any theological discourse which takes seriously the crucifixion resurrection event must partner with God to mend the world of crucifying violence, such as white supremacy. It should provide, therefore, an actual counter-narrative to disrupt the white supremacist narrative that is violent. Doing so begins with forthrightly naming white supremacy as a crucifying reality that stands in opposition to God's justice. It must also make clear Jesus' utter solidarity with crucified classes of people, thereby boldly proclaiming that black and brown lives are sacred. They absolutely matter to God. At the same time, such a theology must work to dismantle the systems and structures that foster violent realities such as poverty and mass incarceration, which again disproportionately impact people of color. Put simply, any theology today which does not confront the cycle of violence perpetuated by white supremacy betrays the God of the crucified Jesus. And so back to the beginning. Almost 55 years ago, as a 7-year-old, I was compelled to become a theologian because of a vow that I made to my 7-year-old self to one day rescue little children from a poverty-stricken life of crucifying violence. In light of that, I resolved in a piece I wrote some 25 years ago that the inhumane, I said, and life-denying circumstances that shape the lives of many of God's people demand that theology be done so that it advances life, freedom, and dignity for all persons. This means for me that in order to be accountable to those children that I encountered some 55 years ago, my theology must rest on partnering with God to stop the violence. This, to me, is what being a womanist theologian is all about. And if I do anything less, I betray the lives of those children that called me into this work, and I blaspheme my grandmother's faith. And so I pray that I remain true to the womanist spirit of Rachel, not to be consoled until the violence against God's sacred humanity